Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone, and we hope you're doing well. Thank you for joining the second series of the Learning Hub. My name is Lina Al-Atasi, and I'm the Head of Innovation at Aman Arab Bank. We're very excited to introduce this new lineup of workshops that are focused on innovative thinking, enhancing your skill sets, and hopefully supporting you with your careers. These workshops will run over the course of the next few months and will focus on diverse topics, which will be announced via our social media pages and on our websites. You can, of course, register for as many workshops as you like, and they're open to everyone. Today, we're very excited to be joined by Mr. Maher Al Kendi from PhazeRO, who will be introducing React. But before we begin, I just wanted to ask our participants, Maher, how many of you are familiar with React? If I could just please ask you to raise your hands. Okay. Great, so there's a lot to learn, obviously. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them in the chat window and Maher will address them. Otherwise, you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions live at the end of the session. Maher, over to you.
All right, thank you. So, okay, I'll introduce myself. My name is Maher Al Kendi, and I'm a software developer with PhazeRO. So today I'll be introducing you to a JavaScript library called React. We'll go through the agenda for today. First, I'll explain what is React. From there, we can see some examples of applications you can build using React. Thirdly, I'll be explaining why you should use React, and it's meant to be a showcase of the features of, that React offers from a technical standpoint. And at the end, we'll go through some key concepts. And that part we'll be doing some live coding during that part. Just to, as I'm explaining the concepts, I'm going to be showing you code examples. All right, let's start. So what is React? For me, the best explanation that I found to describe it was found from the ReactJS website itself, that says that it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And this might seem very general, but really, you can use React to build user interfaces everywhere. And we can see some examples here. In this case, what can we build using React? Here is an example where Airbnb, this is their website, and they've built the user interface using React. However, React is not only for building user interfaces on the web. This is another example on a mobile application. This is, in this case, this is Instagram. And it's not just that. You can build desktop applications, mobile applications, web applications, smart TV applications. I would say that if your platform has a user interface, most likely you can use React to build it. In this presentation, we will mainly focus on the web. So the context will be on the web. In fact, this is the most popular place you'll find React being used, is on the web. So why use React? Here, I'll be going through some of the features, the technical features that React offers. First, reusable components. In this image here, which I got from the Atomic Design book by Brad Frost, he divides a page. The book says that you can divide a page into smaller pieces. And in this case, it calls them templates, and then organisms, molecules, and then finally to the smallest piece, an atom. React follows the same concept. However, everything is a component. What's the value in this? Well, you can take a small piece, such as an atom, and build it in isolation, and then reuse it anywhere in your application. So it helps with separating the concern, but also with reusability. And in this case, you can see for the case of the template, if you're familiar, this is Instagram. This template is created once and then can be repeated as long as your feed is. Next, unidirectional data flow. What that means is that data flows in one direction. If you think about a typical maybe jQuery application, or if you're using plain JavaScript, any file in your application can make changes to the state of the application. And so on the larger scale, that can cause some problems because you don't know exactly where the change is happening or where an event is being triggered or listened to. React helps with that by having a unidirectional data flow. So data is flowed from the parent to the child, and then events are flowed from the can flow from the child to the parent. I'll explain this diagram a little bit more. The way you can think of React is you can think of your application as a tree. And so everything here is a component, but it's the same as here. So in this case, an organism is the parent of a molecule, and a molecule is a parent of an atom. So it's the same thing. However, in React, we call everything a component. And then you can imagine that maybe this component is a button, and an event like a click is triggered. It will go up until it finds where the event is being handled. From there, maybe some data is being generated or something, and then that data, you can push it back to the child. I will note that sibling components cannot share data, nor can they handle each other's events. This can only happen from the parent. So the parent can handle both these events, and the parent can send data to both these components. However, they cannot send data to each other. So this makes everything very predictable in React. Thirdly, I'll explain the concept of virtual DOM and how it's helping us here with, and how it's a feature in React. Before I explain, well, first of all, explain what is a DOM. In order to explain that, we're gonna kind of take a step back and explain what happens when we go to our browser and then you search google.com. So the thing that happens is, number one, HTML file gets sent to you, and your browser starts to parse through that HTML file. As it's parsing through it, it's creating the DOM, or the document object model. And you can think of the DOM as a representation of your HTML, and it's in a tree structure. So we'll go back to number one. There, you get your HTML file. The DOM is slowly, your browser is parsing through your DOM, and it's creating it. Number two, so what's happening in number two and number three is, imagine you're going through your HTML and you find a link tag that links to some CSS. Your browser will immediately start downloading that CSS. Same with the JavaScript. And throughout the process, these three, well, number one, let me wait for the, okay. So number 1, 2, and 3 happen in parallel while building the DOM. Eventually, once the DOM has been created, the CSS DOM is created, CSS object model, and this is a tree representation of your styling. Then number 4, that is the earliest point where JavaScript can run. So that, interestingly, it runs before we can run JavaScript before we see anything in the page. Number 5 is the render tree. That's where the DOM is combined with the CSS DOM. Number 6 is when the browser starts to calculate the layout. And number 7 is when the browser paints the actual page. And by the end of the paint, we get a load event. Now, the part that we'll be focused on actually is number 8. Number 8 is it showcases the case where we want some interactivity in our page. And so we use JavaScript to create that interactivity. And as you know, if you're familiar with how things happen on the web, usually, or familiar with JavaScript, usually what will happen is you select some sort of element, and then either you change the style or you change its position. And so JavaScript will go and through the DOM make some changes to the HTML. This part, number 8, is what React abstracts away from us. So React uses the virtual DOM and abstracts it. I can explain now how React actually abstracts it. In this case, here you can see an example of what how we can imagine the DOM. It's a tree structure. you can see it starts with a document, and then so the actual document goes down. Let me point. So it goes down. Here we have our HTML tag. HTML, as if you're familiar with HTML, you know that it has two children, the body and the head, and so on. The body has the actual content of the page. What React does is it creates an exact replica of the DOM. The only difference, well, one of the differences, and we call this replica the virtual DOM. One of the differences that the virtual DOM has with the real DOM is that the virtual DOM cannot change the HTML directly. Now, what happens is when an event is triggered, say something changes this div, immediately React creates another virtual DOM. So now we have two DOMs. The difference is this original virtual DOM represents the state before this change happened, or this event was triggered, or this action was triggered. And then this new one represents what it looks like after that event happened. Now React internally makes a comparison between the old virtual DOM and the new virtual DOM, and then it does the patching for us. So this is all happening internally. A good way to think about it is this quote here from the ReactJS website. It says, you tell React what state you want the UI to be in, and makes sure the DOM matches that. So basically, we're changing the way we're thinking of how we're building our application when we're using React. In this case, we're thinking about state changes. So we'll be making changes to state. We'll tell React what we want the change to do in terms of what the UI will look like. And then React will abstract away the actual part where we're selecting elements and making changes. All right, so now I'll explain some key concepts in React. And in order to do that, as I'm explaining all the concepts, I'll be going through through code examples just to give you a better image of it. Now, before I actually go to the next slide, I want to introduce the place where we'll be writing the code. This is called Code Sandbox. It allows us to quickly run a text editor and then creates an environment where we can test out any different types of library. I encourage you to use this tool whenever you're trying to test out some new library and you don't want to set it up locally. So first, let me explain what we have here. There's many ways to set up React, but I just want to explain how this particular setup is. So if we come to our practice.json, we can see the dependencies that we have. In this case, the two that we care about are React, of course, the library that we'll be using, and then React DOM. So what is the difference between React and React DOM? Why do we need React DOM? Well, remember when I explained that React can be built on different platforms. What React DOM does is it allows us to build user interfaces on the web. React DOM actually creates the virtual DOM that we were talking about before. Now, we'll go through the files. So we have a public folder. Inside of it is an index.html file. Now, notice one thing. As we go through it, we'll find the body just to see if we can find this content here. And you'll notice that the only thing we have is a div with an ID of root, but there's no content inside of it. So you might be wondering, how are we actually showing this text on the page? And we'll explore the files to actually find out. So, all right, let's go to index.js next. We'll run through the file from the top to bottom. Here, we're importing React. Then we're importing React DOM, which creates our virtual DOM. Here, we're importing this app. We can actually ignore it for now. We'll come back to it. And then in line 6, where this is very familiar if you've done some front-end JavaScript coding, where we're selecting an element by its ID, and the ID is root. If you remember, here, the only thing on our HTML page is a div with an ID of root. So we're selecting this div. If I go back to index.js, after we select it, then we run the render method from the React DOM, and we're rendering something here. The second argument is the root. So it seems, so what's happening here is we're rendering this inside this root element. So let's go to this app. I will say this app is a React component. We'll explain more as we go, but when we get there. But so don't feel like if you don't get it yet, we'll get there when we go through the key concepts. Right now, I'm just going through the files so that we're all familiar. So we go to the app.js file, and here we're importing React again, importing a CSS file, and we have a JavaScript function that we're exporting, that app. And here we finally find our content, and it's represented here by some sort of, well, it looks like HTML to us, but you'll notice here we have class name instead of class. It's a little bit different than HTML, and I'll explain that as well. But this is for sure our content. And actually, if I come here and I add something, you'll notice that, yeah, the content changes. So this is where the content is coming from. I do want to show you something. When you open the dev tools, whoops, open it up, and then let's, you know what? Let me push this back. All right. So click on the content. What I want to show you. Wow. All right. Let me drop all this. Okay. So let's actually select the content. You see here, this is the div with ID roots, and inside of it is our app. So that's what's happening right now, right? I hope this makes sense. I'll bring it back. Okay, let's go back to our slides now. Now that we know all our files and we're happy, we understand our files, and continue presenting. So here are the key concepts we'll be discussing. Number one, JSX. Second is components, specifically React components. Then we'll see how events are handled in React. And finally, we'll talk about state and props in React. So we'll start with JSX. So what is JSX? It's a syntax extension to JavaScript, and we use it to describe our UI. So this is some sort of an extension to JavaScript to describe the user interface. So remember here, where we're seeing this HTML-like template, it's not HTML, it's actually JSX. Just looks like HTML, and in syntax actually is very similar to HTML. There's just slight differences. Like for example here, this class name, in HTML, this would be just a class, but it acts the same. So for example, we have a class of app. If I go to this styles.css, we'll see we have an app class. And if I come here and I change the color to blue, see, it works just like it would work normally in HTML. I'll turn that back. So JSX is just a way for us to represent the UI. That's how you should think about it. It's just a way for us to represent the UI. And I'll show you, the great thing about JSX is that if you're familiar with HTML, then you should feel a little bit more comfortable using it. I'll give you an example here. We can, for example, create a button just like we would do in HTML. And let's maybe add text, click me. And here we have a button. So pretty familiar syntax if you're familiar with HTML. And it has all the attributes that HTML has, again, with some differences in some cases. So, you know, we have a type attribute, we can say type button, and so on. So that is what JSX is. Go back to the slides. Okay. The next concept, we'll talk about React components. So React components are functions or classes that let you split the UI into independent, So React components are functions or classes that let you split the UI into independent pieces. What does that mean? We'll look right here in the code. Let's actually just create a React component, and it will explain it in a much better way. So it's either a function or a class. In my case, I'm just going to stick to using functions for this session. So I'll create a function using React. Notice that, so this function we'll call it button. Notice that I'm using a capital B. That is a convention to denote that that this function is a React component. So I'm sure you'll notice that here app is also a capital letter because app is also a React component. So let's create a function. I'll create it using arrow syntax. And a React component returns some JSX. In this case, let me take this button and remove it away from. I'll drop it here. You'll notice our button doesn't show anymore. However, it's because we moved it to this button component. Now, how do we use a React component? Well, we can put it on the page using this syntax. Now we've created our first custom React component. The great thing about this is that we can style this button separately from our application. We don't have to worry about that, and it's completely separate, and we can add some logic completely separate from the rest of the app, and then reuse it anywhere. And let me show you how we can reuse it. Like, you can add as many buttons as you want. This is like a very powerful feature in React. Once you create a component and you can create it and have it separated from your application, you can reuse it anywhere in your app. So that is React component. Next, let's talk about handling events. So events in React are handled the same way they're handled in the DOM. There's just some syntax differences. So if you've handled event using regular JavaScript and HTML, then you should feel quite comfortable using React, handling events in React. So let's see an example right now. Here we have this button. Let's say we want the button to, anytime we click it, to console log something. Just like in HTML, the button JSX element has an attribute called onClick. Now, in HTML, what we would do is would have a string and maybe say console.log and say hello. Now, will this work? Let's refresh so that I remove the console. We can open the console, see expected onClick listener to be a function, instead got a value of string. So it doesn't work with us. And this is because anytime we're trying to embed JavaScript into JSX, we need curly brackets. Inside these curly brackets, we can use JavaScript. Now, of course, it's expecting a function. So let's create a function. Say console.log. Okay. Now let's test it out. Clear the console. And if I click, see, it works. So very familiar syntax. One typical thing you'll see is that event handlers are separated, are removed away from the template just to make it easier to read. So maybe I'll call it like const handle click. And I'll create a function. Move the console. Now, instead of this anonymous function, we'll call it handle. We'll be calling handle click. Now, anytime we click, we're calling this handle click function, which just console logs clicked to our console. So let's test it out, and it still works. So handling events, it has very familiar syntax to people that have done DOM manipulation or handle events from the using HTML and JavaScript. Okay, let's go to our next concept where we'll be talking about props and state. So let's start with props actually. Here, props are read-only arguments that are passed into React components. So props are a way for us to send data into our components. Remember, data in React is only sent from the parent to the child, and we can see that here. So data flows from parent to child. In this case, the parent is app, and the button is the child. Okay, so if we want to send some data to this button, let's say, whoops, back. Whoa. All right, let's try this again. So let's say we want to send some data. I'll call it, and we can call it anything. We can add an attribute to our React component and call it anything. So for example, I'll say button text. In this case, we can add anything we want. So I'll say submit. Let's call it submit. This now is a prop. By the way, prop is a short for properties. And so it's a property now of this button component. And we can actually access it from the button component itself. How do we do that? Well, each React component gets a props argument. We call it props. This is the convention, right? But it's short for properties. And let's actually see how we can access it. I'll say console.log. I'll show you how you can access data from props. Console.log props dot. We use the same name, button text, to show that it's coming from here. I'll say from button component. All right. So as you can see, we're getting the message from button component submit. So we're sending this custom data into our component, and we can access it. So in this case, I called it button text because I wanted to change the button text here, right? And I wanted the parent to pass in that data. So how do we actually show this data here in our JSX so that it appears here? Well, can't we just do props dot button text? See what happens. No, we can't. Because now it's just reading, it doesn't understand that this is JavaScript. So anytime we want to embed JavaScript into our JSX, we need curly brackets. Now it knows, okay, this is JavaScript, and handles it that way. So now we have the submit button. If I click it, it works the same way. But we're getting this data from the parent. It's being passed as a prop from the parent. All right. Now, let's say we want to make, so right now everything is still static, right? Props cannot be changed, they're read-only values. So let's say we want to make some change on the screen. In this example, like I'll give you an example. Let's say we have here a div, and div has a 0. Okay, I don't like the spacing here. Again, this is just like HTML. You just create a BR, right? And I have a break line, and now I have a space. So I want, anytime I click on this button, this number increments, right? So we want some change on the page. We want to make it a little bit more dynamic. In order to do that, anytime there's some sort of change that you want on the page, any type of, then immediately you should know that you need to add some state to your application. This leads us back to the slides. So what is state? So state is where you store property values that belong to a component. And anytime the state changes, components re-render. Okay, so let's see that in action. So state is just a way to store property value, the properties of a component. And it allows us to make changes to our application. Anytime state is changed, React, I'll come back to, let me show you here. So anytime state is changed, we already have this virtual DOM, right? React already creates this. Anytime state is changed, this copy of the virtual DOM is created, and the comparison happens, and then React patches. So let's see that in action here. Let's create some state. So how do we create state in React? In this case, I'm going to be using something called React hooks. It's the new syntax where we can actually create states in functional components. So first, say const, and I'm using the structuring assignment. This is ES6. I would say React.use state. Okay. So this is just how it's done in React. Once you start using it, you'll get you'll get comfortable with this type of syntax. But basically, we're using this use state hook, and this use state hooks allows us to create state. So in this case, I'll say, maybe I'll call it number, right? This is our state. We have a state. Let's give it an initial value. To give it an initial value, we pass the initial value here. In this case, let's say 0. Now, if we want to use it in our JSX, if I say number, again, it doesn't know what I mean. So we need our curly brackets. And now we see we have 0 showing on the page. To show you that it's coming from here, I mean 12. So yeah, coming from here. This is just represents our initial value. So how do we now make a change on the page? Excuse me. So the way we want this to work is I want to be able to click on this button, and anytime I click, this number increments. However, notice that our handle click, or the event handler, right now is inside this button component. What's the problem with this? Well, our state lives in the parent app. However, we want to make a change from this event handler. We can't do that from the child. The child cannot make state changes to the parent's state. So how do we fix that? Well, anytime you're faced with this type of problems, you just move the event handler to the parent. So we can move this event handler to the parent. Now we're getting an error because it doesn't know what this event handler is. So how do we pass this event handler to this button so that it stops giving me this error? Well, React has a way, which is by sending it as a prop. We can actually send functions. It's not only strings. We can send any type of data as properties into our components. In this case, I'll call it handle click, same name, and handle click. Don't be confused between these two names. This is the actual function, and then this is just a custom name that I picked. And I just picked handle click in this case, same name. Now, in order for us to actually access the function, we need to say props.handleClick. Okay. So if we actually test it, let me open the console, you'll notice that we have the same behavior. However, the click handler is now in the parent. So now, based on React's rule, we can actually make changes to this state. So let's try and make a change right now. The way you do that is use the second value in this array. And this is conventional. You can name it whatever you want, but conventionally you said set number. Usually the convention is set and then the name of your state. Okay, so this set number is a function, and we can pass it our new state. So in this case, instead of console login, it's set number, and then what is our new state? We want it to increment, so we say number plus 1. Okay, we're in the state every time we take this number and we add 1 to it. So let's see that, see how it works. Oops. Yeah. So now, oh, actually, we don't need the console. So as you can see, we're making changes to the page. I'll add I'll add a little bit more to this example. Number one, let's say we don't want it to be submit anymore. We want to change this to now say increment. We don't come here to do it because we're passing this text from the parent. So we can say increment. Yeah. And then let me show you, we can actually reuse this component and say we want to have so let's say decrease, and I'll change this to increase. And so say we want another button, this time to lower the value from by 1. Of course, right now it does the same thing this button does. They just go all up by 1. in order to change that, well, we need to add another event handler. In this case, this one handles the click. So let's change the name of this, because what we need is another event handler, and this event handler will reduce one instead of that. But of course, we need to have separate event handlers because they're different events. So maybe I'll call this handle increase, and say, oops, handle decrease. Then that is what we're going to be passing, handle increase and handle decrease. Okay. So let's test it out. We're increasing and going down. So this is how you make changes in React. Go back to the slide. So yeah, these were the main concepts I wanted to present in React. They are some of the basic concepts that build that allow you to make your application using React. However, there are way more other concepts that React has, and I think best next step, if you found that React is the tool for you, is to go through the React documentation, because I was looking for different resources to present. Truly, I realized that the best resource would be the React documentation. It's very well done, very well written. And so I think that is a good starting point for anybody that wants to understand React and use it in their project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maher. Really appreciate that. Hope everyone found it useful and informative. And thank you for taking us through a demonstration of how they can apply it in practical terms. We'll now open up the opportunity for questions. Does anyone have any questions to ask Maher? Raoud, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to ask a question? I'll just allow Raoud to speak. Raoud? Yeah. Hello, Raoud. Okay, maybe we've lost Raoud. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask Maher? Okay, great. Thank you very much. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to drop them to myin@aman-arabbank.com. As I mentioned, one of the participants asked earlier about attendance certificates. We're more than happy to provide letters. Just drop us a line at the email I mentioned earlier. I'll just put it in the chat box right now as well. I just want to thank Maher once again for taking the time to take us through React. And these workshops will also be broadcasted on our YouTube channel for those of you who've missed it, or if you have friends or colleagues who'd like to watch and just recap. And I'm sure Maher would be happy to answer any questions post this session. Thank you once again, Maher. Really appreciate it. And thank you for running this. Our next workshop will be on the 24th. And for more information about our workshops, as I mentioned earlier, please visit our website or our social media pages. We have all the details of the timings, how you can register, and obviously it's open to everyone. It's for free. It's only for your learning and knowledge. So we hope you enjoy these sessions, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all. Thank you very much for joining.